So that's one problem I foresee in the coverage, is that people may feel that it's hopelessly complicated and throw up their hands, especially because you have a concerted effort from the beginning to essentially spread propaganda and conspiracy theories coming directly from the Oval Office. As you pointed out, in previous impeachments, whether it was Nixon or Clinton to a certain extent, of course, you had a situation where the president and their team was pushing back very aggressively, even crossing the line at times to misinformation. But the flip side is, I don't believe that we've ever had a real-time public effort at this kind of propaganda and conspiracy theory coming directly from inside the Oval Office. And so that makes it even harder, given the conventions of our journalism today. On all of the shows, you have people trying to discuss the facts as they've come out in the Ukraine case. And then you have defenders of the president, many of them advancing untrue, blatantly mistruths, even in their efforts to advocate and to put the best possible spin on it. This isn't spin as we knew it, where you both agree on the facts, but one side makes a point advocating for the other. This is the president and his defender saying things that are outrageously untrue. And so I think that's a huge media challenge. For example, the president himself demanded from the Ukrainian president, according to the transcript the White House itself put out, he's advancing a debunked conspiracy theory that was totally false, saying that somehow Ukraine has a server that was setting up Russia in the 2016 election hacking. Trump's own former Homeland Security advisor went on TV this morning and said, this is completely false. I told the president this, and yet he and Rudy Giuliani advanced it anyways. This is mind-blowing. And so I think it's a huge challenge for journalists covering this.
Yeah, the disinformation, the lies are a big part of the story, and maybe someday a big part of the impeachment. Susan, thank you. To the panel, thank you. My final rule of thumb here, no one knows what is going to happen. So don't believe people who say they do.
Tell you the facts. They called me.
Rudy Giuliani is fighting back.
I wasn't operating on my own.
Insisting his talks with Ukrainian officials were proper, important, and encouraged by the U.S. State Department.
In fact, I'm a legitimate whistleblower.
So why is President Trump's personal lawyer so worked up? It comes in the wake of news about the now infamous call between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. In that call, Giuliani's name comes up repeatedly as Trump asks for foreign help investigating Democrat Joe Biden. Rudy very much knows what's happening, Trump says. If you could speak to him, that would be great. That has raised accusations Giuliani was acting as an improper agent of the State Department, arranging a political hit job from afar in the name of official business. Giuliani says no way he was helping investigate corruption, and he says he has a paper trail that proves it, including this text message from a State Department official arranging a meeting.
I went to meet Mr. Zelensky's aide at the request of the State Department. 15 memos make that clear.
The State Department says Mr. Giuliani is a private citizen and acts in a personal capacity as a lawyer for President Trump. He does not speak on behalf of the U.S. government. But he has spoken for Trump many times.
What you just said is totally erroneous. It's not a crime.
Attacking his foes, dismissing his critics.
It depends on where it came from. It didn't obstruct.
The president calls him a loyal ally.
Rudy's a very straight shooter.
His critics call him something else.
He is the political henchman for the president.
And Giuliani is clearly hedging his bets against another potential title he could be saddled with if the Ukraine affair gets much messier. Fall guy.
You say you have lost over $400,000 since President Trump came in office. I mean, that is stunning. Tell us what it's been like for you and for other farmers during the president's trade war.
Well, every time we think the market stabilized, I sold a lot of grain last year at harvest for $5.70, and that was at a loss, and I felt bad doing it, but I didn't have any room for it. Well, it ended up that was an awful good move, and right now our market is $3.96 here locally. So it's at $4.40 a bushel. I lost $70 an acre just putting my crop in this year. Wow. And now we're down to $3.96.
Wow. How do you feel about the administration's $16 billion farm bailout, though?
Well, this one's a lot fairer than the last one. I think the last one, top 10% farms took 70% of that payment. So it was kind of a payback to the buddy type of thing. But this one's set up better, but it's somewhat confusing because the county I'm in, we're going to get $15 an acre back. And there's other counties in our state that are going to get over $50 an acre. So it just seems odd why the difference in the amount that you're going to get.
Yeah.
We're all taking a hit.
Yeah. Listen, I know you're not a politician. You may not be that political, but if I can ask you a question about the political perspective here. Farmers and other rural voters are a big part of the president's base. Now, you didn't vote for President Trump in 2016, but from conversations you are having with other folks, do you think the president is in danger of losing any of that support in 2020?
Well, if he doesn't lose 100% of it from the Farm Belt, then people are kind of crazy because this is not going well for farmers at all. I mean, some of them are trying to be faithful because they made that decision and voted for him. But I'd have to say in the back of their minds, they're just not very happy right now.
2 people are dead, 2 others are hurt after a roller coaster went off the tracks at a popular amusement park in Mexico City. Now, according to officials, one of the roller coaster's carriages hit a metallic structure attached to the ride and then derailed. Eyewitnesses told local media they watched in horror as the victims fell to the ground. A formal investigation is now underway to determine how this happened and who will be held responsible.
Susan, the president is buying into conspiracy theories and promoting disinformation. What in the world do you think the news media should be doing in order to explain what's happening?
Yeah, so take, for example, this sort of conspiracy theory about Ukraine, the mention of CrowdStrike in this transcript that some of the sort of right-wing media has seized onto. This is a conspiracy theory. It's a debunked conspiracy theory. Essentially, the idea here is that the Ukrainians somehow framed the Russians. So going back to sort of one of the earliest themes of President Trump's presidency, denying that the Russians had actually been involved in Russian interference in the election. Now, the FBI has investigated this question, determined it was the Russians. The U.S. intelligence community has determined it's the Russians. Bob Mueller actually indicted 12 Russian military officers by name for their involvement. So that's the degree of sort of evidence we have of Russian involvement. And yet all this time later, 2.5 years later, we still have the president of the United States, asking the leader of a foreign country to basically dig up some evidence to validate this theory. And so one challenge for the media is how do you explain the conspiracy theory without actually giving additional credence by explaining that there is nothing to this whatsoever. Even the president's own advisors are telling him this isn't true, and yet he is persisting in this frankly bizarre belief.
Let's talk about some other challenges for the press in the weeks ahead. One of them involves the whistleblower. The New York Times reported some information on the whistleblower's identity, specifically where the person works. CNN has chosen not to get into that information, but a few other papers followed the Times and published the information. What do you think is right and wrong here?
Yes, this is a difficult question. So as someone who formerly worked in the U.S. intelligence community, I tend to think that the press shouldn't ever be publishing lots of information about intelligence officers. That said, there is a big question here of whether sort of the ordinary rules apply or not. Usually whenever the media believes that the identity of an intelligence officer or a government official is relevant to a story, true and newsworthy, they print it unless the United States government can give them a very specific reason not to. Not just saying, hey, you might get this person hurt, but really explaining how it actually could, be a threat to somebody's life. So in this circumstance, we would ordinarily expect the U.S. government to be the person who's protecting this person's identity. And if the media thought it was relevant to include these details, for them to report that. But we're in a little bit of a different world now because, of course, the United States government, with the president at the head of the executive branch, is actually attacking this person. And so I do think the press has to take a step back and say, hey, is this sort of the ordinary rules of the game where we're talking about whether or not we're going to, report on what agency somebody might work for, or is instead we're going to treat this person more like we would a dissident, somebody who's actually being attacked by their own government, and sort of what are our ethical obligations. And this really is largely uncharted territory for domestic national security reporting.
Do you think former Trump officials have an obligation, a duty to the country to speak out right now?
I do, and I think that this is one of the sort of interesting questions about sort of what the impeachment inquiry, how that's going to shift the momentum and burden. So we've seen this White House assert sort of executive privilege claims that are really beyond the law, right? Saying even Corey Lewandowski, who never worked in the government, he doesn't have to testify because he is somehow covered by executive privilege. So they've really used this as sort of a sword and a shield. The reality is executive privilege is not all that powerful against former officials who want to testify, right? The only thing the White House can do if somebody wants to testify is threaten to fire them. If you've already been fired, if you've already left, that's not much of sort of a stick. And so it really is up to these individual people who've worked in the White House, who have firsthand knowledge about some of the abuses that we're now seeing reported. And so they're going to have to make a judgment about whether or not they want to continue to be silent, or in the face of these really, really serious accusations and a congressional impeachment inquiry, that very sort of important function for the congressional branch, if they're going to come forward and tell what they know.
And 30 seconds left, Susan. What's the most important thing the press has got to do in the days to come? I think it's that we have to make sure we keep in mind what we already know. Forget what's ahead. What we already know is damning.
Yes, I think this really is the critical challenge as this scandal starts to unfold and really get into weedy issues like how exactly are classified servers segmented, really kind of specific and confusing issues, that the media not lose sight of what is in that transcript, what we already know, we already have confirmed, and sort of the big picture here. And the big picture here is that the White House has itself confirmed the President of the United States abused his office to pressure a foreign leader, to extort a foreign leader into essentially violating the civil liberties of a U.S. citizen by launching this investigation absent a criminal predicate. That is an abuse of office. That is what the impeachment inquiry is all about. That's why we're seeing such outrage and momentum on Capitol Hill. And so as we get into these important details, it's important to not lose sight of the need to communicate that really, really important big picture.
Susan, thank you.